How did we get to a point where politicians who used to promise tax cuts are now campaigning on taxing the wealthy more? Just 20 years ago, suggesting a wealth tax would have been political suicide. Today, it's becoming a mainstream talking point from London to Washington to Paris. Even countries that have historically been friendly to the ultra-rich are suddenly changing their tune. But here's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. The people pushing hardest for these wealth taxes aren't your typical left-wing activists. They're economists, policy experts, and even some wealthy individuals themselves who are saying that something fundamental has broken in how our economies work. And the numbers they're looking at are honestly pretty shocking. Before we dive into why this is happening now, there's something you need to understand about how wealth taxes actually work. Because when most people hear wealth tax, they think it's just another way to soak the rich, but the reality is far more complex, and the implications go way beyond just revenue collection. A wealth tax is fundamentally different from an income tax. While income taxes hit the money you earn each year, wealth taxes target the total value of everything you own. Your house, your stock portfolio, your art collection, your business holdings. Everything gets added up, and you pay a percentage of that total value every single year, regardless of whether those assets actually generated any cash for you. Now, you might be wondering why this matters to you if you're not exactly swimming in Picassos and private jets. Well, here's where it gets interesting. The push for wealth taxes isn't really about the wealthy at all. It's about what's been happening to everyone else. Over the last 4 decades, something unprecedented has occurred in most developed economies. The relationship between working hard and building wealth has fundamentally shifted. Previous generations could reasonably expect that steady employment, saving money, and maybe buying a house would lead to financial security. That formula has basically stopped working for most people. Meanwhile, asset prices have exploded. Not just stocks, but real estate, collectibles, private businesses, and pretty much anything that wealthy people can park their money in. The result is that people who already owned significant assets have seen their wealth multiply, while the people who rely primarily on wages have been treading water or falling behind. This isn't just about inequality for its own sake. When wealth becomes this concentrated, it starts to warp how the entire economy functions. Wealthy individuals and families can afford to bid up prices on everything from housing to education to political influence. They can take risks that regular people can't afford because they have massive financial cushions. They can wait out market downturns, buy assets when prices crash, and generally play by different rules than everyone else. What's particularly frustrating for policymakers is that traditional tools for addressing these problems don't seem to work anymore. Raising income taxes mainly hits high earners, but the truly wealthy often don't have traditional incomes. They live off appreciation in their assets, which isn't taxed until they sell. They can borrow against their holdings and use sophisticated financial structures to minimize their tax obligations. This has created what some economists call a two-tier system. There's the economy that most people live in, where you trade time for money and pay taxes on everything you earn. Then, there's the economy that the ultra-wealthy live in, where money makes money and taxes are largely optional. The wealth tax proposal is essentially an attempt to force the second economy to contribute more to the first one. But implementing something like this is incredibly complicated. How do you value a private business? What about art or collectibles? How do you prevent wealthy individuals from simply moving their assets offshore? These aren't just technical challenges, they go to the heart of how modern economies are structured. Wealth taxes require governments to essentially conduct annual audits of their richest citizens' entire financial lives. They need international cooperation to prevent capital flight. They need sophisticated valuation methods for assets that don't trade on public markets. Some countries have tried this before with mixed results. France implemented a wealth tax that generated revenue, but also prompted some wealthy individuals to relocate. But the current push for wealth taxes is different. It's happening at a time when traditional tax avoidance strategies are becoming more difficult to implement. International information sharing has improved dramatically. Digital tracking of financial assets has become more sophisticated. And perhaps most importantly, there's growing political pressure to address wealth concentration before it destabilizes entire societies. The question isn't really whether wealth taxes are technically feasible anymore. The question is whether they're politically sustainable and economically necessary. And that's where things get really interesting. Because what's driving this sudden enthusiasm for wealth taxes isn't just academic theory or political posturing. It's a growing recognition that we're facing what economists are calling a feedback loop crisis. The more wealth concentrates at the top, the more power that wealth accumulates to influence the very policies designed to address the concentration. It's like trying to fix a rigged game while the people who rigged it are still holding all the cards. This dynamic has created some genuinely weird situations. You've got billionaires funding think tanks that argue against taxing billionaires. You've got politicians who campaigned on tax reform suddenly discovering that their biggest donors aren't thrilled with that particular campaign promise. You've got regulatory agencies staffed by people who used to work for the industries they're supposed to regulate and probably will again once they leave government service. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some of the loudest voices supporting wealth taxes are coming from inside the House. Warren Buffett has been arguing for years that he shouldn't pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. Bill Gates has endorsed higher taxes on the wealthy. Even some hedge fund managers are saying the current system is unsustainable. Now, you might cynically assume these guys are just trying to buy good publicity or ward off more serious reforms. And maybe some of them are. But there's also a legitimate economic argument that extreme wealth concentration is bad for business. When most people don't have disposable income, consumer demand suffers. When housing costs eat up massive portions of household budgets, people spend less on everything else. When education becomes unaffordable, you get skill shortages that hurt productivity. The wealthy might be winning in the short term, but they're potentially killing the economic ecosystem that made their wealth possible in the first place. It's like strip mining your own backyard. Sure, you get rich quick, but eventually there's nothing left to extract. This is why wealth tax discussions have moved beyond just progressive politics into mainstream economic policy. Central banks are starting to worry about wealth inequality as a systemic risk. International organizations like the IMF are publishing research on how concentration of assets affects economic stability. Even conservative economists are acknowledging that something needs to change, even if they disagree on what that something should be. The technical challenges remain enormous. Wealth taxes require massive bureaucratic infrastructure that most countries simply don't have. They need international coordination that's politically difficult to achieve. They need enforcement mechanisms that can keep up with increasingly sophisticated avoidance strategies. And they need to be designed in ways that don't accidentally hammer middle-class families who happen to own valuable but illiquid assets. But the political momentum is clearly building. Polls consistently show majority support for higher taxes on the wealthy across most developed countries. Young voters in particular seem to view extreme wealth concentration as fundamentally illegitimate. And perhaps most importantly, the traditional arguments against wealth taxes are losing their persuasive power. For decades, opponents could argue that taxing wealth would hurt economic growth or drive away job creators. But when wages have stagnated while asset prices soared, when productivity gains have been captured almost entirely by capital owners, when entire generations are being priced out of homeownership and retirement security, those arguments start to sound pretty hollow. The question now isn't whether some form of wealth taxation is coming. The question is what form it will take and how quickly it will be implemented. Some proposals focus narrowly on the ultra-wealthy, targeting only households worth tens of millions or more. Others cast a wider net, including anyone with significant asset holdings. Some emphasize revenue generation, others focus on reducing inequality, and still others prioritize changing economic incentives. What's becoming clear is that doing nothing is no longer a viable political option. The current trajectory leads to social instability that makes everyone worse off, including the wealthy, which means that one way or another, the rules of the game are about to change dramatically. So where does this leave us? The wealth tax debate represents something much bigger than just another policy discussion. It's essentially a referendum on whether we're willing to acknowledge that our current economic system has produced outcomes that most people find unacceptable. The old playbook of cutting taxes and hoping wealth trickles down has run its course, and even the people who benefited most from that approach are starting to admit it. Whether wealth taxes are the right solution remains to be seen. They're complicated, they're unprecedented at this scale, and they could have unintended consequences that we won't fully understand until it's too late to reverse course. But what's undeniable is that the status quo isn't working for most people, and when the status quo stops working, change becomes inevitable. The real question isn't whether we should tax wealth. The real question is whether we can design a system that addresses the underlying problems without creating new ones. Because at the end of the day, this isn't really about punishing success or redistributing money. It's about preserving the economic foundations that make success possible in the first place. And right now, those foundations are looking pretty shaky. The next few years are going to be fascinating to watch, and the decisions made during this period will shape economic policy for decades to come. So pay attention, because whether you love the idea or hate it, wealth taxes are coming, and they're going to affect all of us.